In 2024, Root and Reed broke down what they called the Western worldview. They argue that this worldview is binary, materialist, individualist, linear, and expansionist. What a mouthful. Let's talk about each term here. Binary, meaning focused on dualisms, forward and backward, civilized and uncivilized, true or false, nature or culture, instead of seeing spectrums and complexity and gray areas. Materialist means focused on physical processes. Individualist implies a focus on individual people rather than analysis at a community level. Linear relates to the idea of forward progress versus other conceptions of time as cyclical, like the seasons, for example. And expansionist, geared toward continuous growth. And we see links here to the economy, in particular, the connections between Western science and capitalism. Root and Reed argue that disaster studies, informed by modern science and the Western worldview, is rooted in the physicalist paradigm. This paradigm relies on causal determinism, so it seeks to uncover laws of cause and effect. So if A happens, then B will happen. In other words, B is determined by A. And this approach sees laws as universal rather than local and contextual. The physicalist paradigm privileges deductive reasoning. It seeks truth by moving downwards, whereas abductive reasoning, characteristic of indigenous knowledges, gains intuitive insight through pattern recognition by working upwards. The physicalist paradigm tends to separate nature from society, rather than seeing them in relation to one another, as indigenous knowledge systems do. And because of these qualities, the physicalist paradigm is very well equipped to provide reductionist insights of isolated physical systems. And these characteristics of modern science continue to inform disaster studies today. For example, it's common to view disasters as one-time physical events rather than slow, ongoing socio-political processes. The idea that modern science is deeply rooted in the Western paradigm of expansion and linear progress relates to Thrush and Ludwin's second point, that scientific investigations of the Northwest Coast contributed to displacement of indigenous peoples. In other words, colonial science and imperialism worked together. How did this happen? Thrush argues that material things like money, laws, and maps transformed indigenous territories into properties for colonizers, and so did science. Geological investigations of the northwest coast of North America went hand in hand with the dispossession of the region's indigenous peoples and their denigration, dismissal, and dismantling of their systems of knowledge. European colonizers weren't just interested in the geography of the places they colonized, but they were also looking for valuable resources like gold and coal. They conducted detailed studies of Cascadia's features, like the shape of the land and the types of the soil. They didn't just study the land for the sake of knowledge. They used their findings to justify taking over the land and dispossessing indigenous peoples. For example, when they found gold or coal, it attracted more settlers who came to mine these resources, further displacing indigenous communities. This geological map on the screen is titled The New El Dorado, a complete view of the newly discovered gold fields. This woodblock print helped promote the Stolo or Fraser River gold rush to prospective miners in the 1850s. There is certainly a lot to unpack with this image. Maps like these were crucial in attracting tens of thousands of settlers to BC, which was already populated with indigenous peoples. Take a few seconds to examine this map. What's standing out to you about it? What's there and what is missing? For one thing, the words newly discovered speak to beliefs about terra nova, or empty lands. At the bottom left here, we see a European ship entering the territory. There is minimal animal or human life shown throughout the region. The bottom right appears to depict 3 or maybe 4 indigenous people as passive observers, casually lounging and watching while colonizers enter these lands to look for gold. So, while we might think of science as objective and rational and being separate from imperialism, it was actually used to reinforce and justify colonial dispossession. Now let's continue teasing out this fraught relationship between modern science and indigenous knowledges identified by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Thrush and Ledwin's third point is useful for this. They argue that European imperialism relied upon and benefited from indigenous knowledges while also denying the legitimacy of these knowledges. They write, though the agents of empire often denigrated local and indigenous forms of knowledge, their denigration only thinly masked the fact that to no small degree, those forms of practical knowledge made the empire possible. For instance, colonial botanizing, the search for new foods and medicines, was often at the imperial project's heart. Colonial botanizing routinely depended on indigenous and other forms of local knowledge. This manifests in our modern diets and medical practices. For example, the potato is a staple in Western diets today. However, multiple indigenous communities farmed them. Within the context of medicine, indigenous peoples of Turtle Island introduced several treatments that Europeans have since adapted. Notably, indigenous people shared their cure for scurvy with white settlers. This cure was a concoction of ground coniferous needles and bark boiled in water. In fact, the World Health Organization in 2023 found that around 40% of pharmaceutical products today draw from traditional knowledge, including one landmark drug that you might have heard of and even used. That drug is aspirin. Other drugs include treatments for malaria and treatments for childhood cancer. Many indigenous treatments have been tested by indigenous peoples for thousands of years, not just a clinical trial for a few months. So, these are just a few examples of how, while colonizers were looking down on indigenous knowledge, the settler colonial state in many ways relied and still relies on this knowledge. Given this, we cannot just blindly celebrate modern science and indigenous knowledge systems coming together to better understand the natural world. We must also critically interrogate the mechanisms in which this coexistence occurs and ask, who benefits? This new interest in using indigenous knowledge together with modern science has some scholars and indigenous leaders concerned about how this could reproduce colonial inequalities. One concern is that it will result in what scientist and global justice advocate Vandana Shiva has named biopiracy, the creation of property through the piracy or theft of others' wealth. Biopiracy is not new. It has been happening for a long time. Historically, when empires were expanding, they often searched for new foods and medicines, and this typically relied on the knowledge of indigenous and local communities. In recent times, corporations have harmfully patented or trademarked indigenous knowledge and resources. This short documentary gives us insight into the biopiracy of stevia,